Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is Plantations of the Mind. My guest is James Tunney, author of many books, including The Mystical Accord, The Mystery of the Trapped Light, Empire of Scientism, Tech Bondage, Human Entrance to Transhumanism, and most recently, Plantation of the Automatons. James is based in Gothenburg, Sweden, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, James. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
Great to see you, my friend. Looking well as always, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Your work is so broad, I can hardly find a first question to begin with. But let's talk about the word plant, implant, plantation. It seems to have both positive and negative meanings, and I know you're looking at both of them.
And that's really a critical idea. One of my arguments is that although we know about plants, we fail to appreciate the significance of plants. For example, in our language and concepts, plants are everywhere. Words like, well, from the very basis of culture and cult and cultivate, all these ideas are associated with planting images. Semen, seminary, seed, all these words we associated with high technology. Genes, hybrid, clones are all plant images, metaphors, motifs, and also the way we think. We think about, in terms of trees. There's great debates about Darwin and his depiction of the theory of evolution as a tree, and there's loads of articles about the notion of what a tree means to us. And also, from psychology, they use tests, the tree drawing tests, for example, and how a person draws a tree can indicate certain things about them. And now they're using it to determine whether a person may have Alzheimer's, because the crown may be reduced if they have. It's quite remarkable, because there's a very close, a symbiotic relationship. That's part of the thing. We co-evolve with plants. And this symbiosis is a really important and deep idea. Now, my argument is that this plant idea is so embedded, is so central to all spiritual traditions. The tree of life, the tree of good and knowledge, the various trees in paradise. The notion of paradise itself, if we ask people to think, well, what is the image that might come unconsciously forward in your brain about paradise? It's usually associated with hanging around in a garden for people, because the idea of paradise is founded on the idea of a garden. We fell out of a paradise, and we're aspiring to return to a paradise. This is nearly all the traditions. And trees are very important in all spiritual traditions. So the positive side is there. The tree represents, for people like Tolkien, it represents a symbol of the natural world. And the opposite side is one that we're less clear about. For example, in the United States, there's books of literary theory by Leo Marx wrote about the machine in the garden. This idea of, well, we have the garden, the pastoral idea associated with Jefferson and those leaders in the United States, and there's a machine we can see coming in literature in the 19th century in Moby Dick, with Hawthorne and other books. It's a lack of certainty created by the intrusion of this machine into the pastoral ideal. But this was there much earlier on. For example, in Europe, the royalty had gardens of automata going back for hundreds of years to tie into what we talked about. So there was the machine in the garden, a literal machine representing the human. And now we're facing a situation where the garden itself is becoming a machine. that the idea of plantation, the historical idea, is being applied on a broader scale. And in that idea is a kind of remarkable concept that a lot of people don't understand, that the model of the forces, the corporate forces that seek to control us, are predicated on the idea of the human as a plant and the transformation of a human into a plant. And this is a remarkable idea that we see. So yes, there's a danger that the positive view, symbiotic idea of our relationship with a plant, and a negative view where the organic plant becomes a mechanical plant, including us and the system of government. And that's a deep way, if you like, to compare the two trees that we can choose between.
Well, I guess fundamentally what you're saying is there's a big difference between a garden and a plantation.
The idea of plantation in the United States is dependent or determined by the horrible experience with African American slavery, with transatlantic slavery. It was a particularly nasty and horrible episode in human history with the triangle of trade. But the phenomenon of plantation is much older, and it goes back to the Roman times. And the ideas of colony and rewarding your troops with land is the essence of a systematic expansion of empire. And in particular, I identified the strand that grew up in the United Kingdom, in particularly in the 1500s, and was developed in Ireland, where the plantation model, which preceded or operate in parallel with the system in the United States. Now, the plantations initially are not the plantations of crops, they're the plantation of people. So what is being planted are people. Associated with that is usually a shift to a single crop, which by arbitrage they can use to bring to metropolitan markets. But it's the plantation of people is important. For example, in the United States, the early reservations that grew out of for Native Americans that grew out of places in Massachusetts were called Indian plantations. So they were planting the native people. They weren't planted. It wasn't for the purposes of growing crops. And to tell the lie of that idea, if we look at Ireland, we've had this discussion before about the history of Ireland, and a lot of people think that Ireland was always poor, but at various stages Ireland was very rich in natural resources, and that was why it was desired. And in the 17th century, it was particularly rich in wood, which was necessary for the expansion of ships and buildings, and when wood was the important commodity. And the plantations a particular plantation of Ulster was associated with the destruction of the native vegetation. So the idea of the planting was the exact opposite. It was associated with planting people. And in that context, they eradicated the ancient woods, and they chased the people in the woods as well. It's the same philosophy as the U.S. Army used in Vietnam with the attacking the jungle with exfoliants and Agent Orange, etc., because they don't want any place for the native people to hide. So plantation is a policy. It's ancient policy. We can trace it back to Egypt, to Babylon. It's an ancient idea of using people and sending them to an area for a particular purpose, usually associated in the end with cultivating land, usually associated with cultivating a particular crop. And that's another aspect of plants, that if we look at the history of trade, it's often about plants. Columbus is going looking for spices. So in the cold 17th century, when there was a change in temperature, spices were particularly welcome in Europe. The Dutch and the Spice Islands, for example, the Dutch were very important in traveling to Asia and bringing back certain plants, and the same with the British and the French. And they began to use botany as well as an instrument of gaining power. So we always have this nice association with botany and the nice botanist. But actually, if you look at, for example, Australia, where they sent tens of thousands of prisoners from Ireland and England, was to Botany Bay. And Botany Bay was named because when Captain Cook landed with his botanical crew, they were interested in the botanical element because that was an essential part of the mission. And it was the botanists, who was people like Joseph Banks and that proposed that they would use these places to colonize these places. And it's another interesting little connection to show how pervasive this is. Around Berkeley, as far as I understand, I was there once, but there's a lot of eucalyptus along the road, and that was spread from Australia in the space of about 100 years. So although the vast majority of eucalyptus trees are in Australia, there's now, the latest figure is 22 million hectares of eucalyptus around the world, and a lot of that is inappropriate to the native vegetation. So the point is that plantation is an imperial colonial process, a strategic use and movement of people. And the person who wrote about this most particularly, we'll pick one person, is Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon was a great proponent of plantation. So it became a technique, and it informed how science grew and the notion of science. And a lot of the quantification, taxonomy, etc., was associated with administration of the whole network.
It's interesting that you bring up Francis Bacon. I've done other interviews in which people suggest he was a great esoteric master and a very wise person, but you're highlighting the dark side of Francis Bacon in your book.
I tried, coming from an Irish perspective, to be as objective as possible. I have been in communication with there's a few good academics writing about Bacon, so I look at other contemporary stuff, and you can't get away from it. Put aside whatever great possibilities there are around him. He defines the modern world. So if you want to think that's great, that's fine, but he was a very dark underbelly to the whole policy. He believed in plantation and displacement and the superiority of the planters, if you like, and that's he wrote an essay on plantation. You can see the ethos and the idea of exploitation, which is also associated with John Dee, the magician to Queen Elizabeth. He was quite involved in this idea as well. So there is a kind of occult background to it as well, about dominance, control. And although people say, well, he didn't really say these words about torturing nature, he did use plenty of words. Nature was something to be abused. So there was something in a kind of deep, divine, misogynistic kind of ethos to it. But the other connection as well that's relevant is that he wrote The New Atlantis, which in many ways is the anticipation of the power of the Royal Society, the power of an elite scientific group that controls society, that masters the earth, that takes its resources. And that attitude comes through Thomas H. Huxley and also Bernal. So by the time we come to the 20th century, there's an idea that not only would this ethos be able to control geopolitics, but it would control everything, and that they would control the environment. And one last point on that, Jeffrey. We mentioned the Crystal Palace last week, that when Dostoevsky came to London and he realized that this was an important symbol of the future. And the glass house is fundamentally associated with the cultivation of plants. Although we can trace it back in particular to the 1500s, really when the Dutch started bringing back plants from hot climates, they had to create these glass houses. And the glass house became the forerunner of ideas of shopping malls, of arcades, and that's what Walter Benjamin was working on. And it's even, if you watched, I don't know if you watched The Simpsons at all, but they have the cartoon program. They have in one episode, they're building a glass dome over Springfield. And this is what a lot of dystopian writers and people like John Lilly talked about, that we would live in a glass dome eventually. That model comes from the idea of acclimatization, of controlling the environment, of that deep scientific domination, control over the environment and over people, and it's directly related to some of the future plans. So yeah, Bacon, I can't. The more I look at him, there's a total lack of compassion there. There's a total lack of respect for nature. It's the pure dominating force. So despite all that, the nice notions that people draw about it, you can find better theorists who wrote about motion, for example, and better stewards of the scientific discipline than him.
Well, you indicated that Bacon defined the modern world, and it sounds very oppressive, but it seems to me that this sort of oppression goes back to the very early times. Ancient Egypt must have been a terribly oppressive culture.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I can look at the benefits gained from science, and we can move on from that. I'm not fond of this idea of interpreting every contemporary phenomenon in those historical terms, or blaming it on the English or blaming it on the British. It's a ridiculous. You can get to some ridiculous positions on that, and it is a recurrent phenomenon. There's no question about that. So we don't say that these are particularly bad people. This is the tradition that, as you said, goes back to ancient times, and Egypt is no great model, although Egypt and Greece were both very important in the mindset, and Rome were very important in the imperial mindset. My argument would be that the British Empire in particular, with the Dutch Empire, a lot of people forget about how powerful the Netherlands has been in this, and particularly when after William of Orange comes to the throne in Britain, the power of the Sea Empire continues to this day. So the domination of the seas became the model for global geopolitical dominance, and that became the basis of the development of the international telecommunications network, and particularly from the 1850s onwards. And this is the model of globalization, the Atlanticist model, which continued to the Pacific after they got to California, went on to Japan to continue the axis. But so what we're talking about is a particular congruence and confluence of historical forces that can happen in any society. But there's a difference. The genius, in many ways, of the imperial focus in Britain has been so successful and translated into a global endeavor through moving up the chain of command away from just political control to economic, commercial, technological control, is the danger that it can inflict a totalizing model which extends into the human consciousness itself. And that's where this scientific left brain dominating mindset that Ian McGilchrist talks about, it has a vehicle derived from a vast range of historical forces that really threatens human consciousness itself. That's the problem.
It does seem, if you regard Bacon as one of the people who defined the modern world, and as I recall, defined the scientific method, you indicated there were alternatives. What are some of the alternatives?
Alternatives to what?
To Bacon.
If you look at the reports, and I've read them in English and in Spanish, that came back from the conquistadores, from the invasion of Peru and Mexico, what they found there, apart from the propagandistic elements, and which were there, I mean, we're talking about empires there as well, so people glorify the native traditions, but they were imperialists as well. We're talking about the Aztecs and the Incas, and they did terrible things to their neighbors. So we shouldn't just glorify what was there. But it's quite clear from the descriptions firsthand that the South American and Central American nations had produced some incredible civilized models. They were very in touch with, knowledgeable about the stars, astronomy. They had developed beautiful cities of canals and horticulture, and the descriptions in Spanish are beautiful. Again, subject to the point that they're also empires. And they, for example, so they had their own system of knowledge, which was as scientific, and people are understanding that one of the genius elements of empire is to take other people's system of knowledge. So, for example, if we take Hans Sloane, who was actually born in Ireland, but in the planter class there, and he's the man behind the British Museum. It's really his collection that establishes the British Museum in the mid-18th century. But he goes to Jamaica, and we have the sugar plantations there. And he learned of the slaves as well. He learned about the cultivation of certain plants, the cola nut and things like that would be the basis of massive businesses around the place. And the same with bananas. They took the information and they brought it back, and then they cultivated particular examples that would allow economic dominance. So a particular brand of banana came from the British Empire. A particular brand of cotton was developed in the Physic Garden in London, and that was the one that was used in the United States. So they began to control the technology of plants, but they learned a lot of the technology from other cultures. And the Dutch were excellent at going out to Java and Indonesia and learning their knowledge. So there's a lot more material understanding that there was no less scientific in these other countries. And we have ideas also of traditional environmental knowledge. It was as scientific, but it wasn't the particular type of science that had grown up in Europe. And I would also say one point that the science in Europe was heavily influenced by the Catholic Church, and a lot of people don't concede that point. They say, oh, well, science kind of grew up independently. But the scholastic tradition was very, very important in ways of thinking about science and the scientific method, for example. And this was actually one of the reasons why science grew up in Europe as opposed to China in that particular form or in other countries. And although there was a strong Islamic scientific tradition, it was very influential, there were particular factors associated with a wider cultural ethos that gave birth to, not least law, that gave birth to the peculiar successful scientific method. And so what I would say is that there are all kinds of alternative approaches, including people would point to Tesla in a more modern context. There are different ways of doing things, but if you attach your scientific method to imperial interests, well, then you get a particular type of imperial science, and that is the problem. It's the confluence of imperial utilitarianism with scientific method, and that can be seen in the life of Robert Boyle as well. He was working on fantastic scientific investigations, but they're also involved in trying to find how they could apply this science to the imperial methodology. And it's the exact same with Thomas Huxley, who also used the example of the garden, that we're going to use this garden, we'll plant the people there, and we'll exploit it. So it's this link with power, with taking other people's things, with not being consistent with nature, with what C.S. Lewis described as not being consistent with the Tao. So although a lot of people see him as a purely Christian writer, he talked about the Tao. And what he said was, we can either seek to dominate nature and the Tao, or we can work with it. And in all the perennial traditions, you recognize a higher force and accommodate yourself to it, as opposed to imposing your mind on it. And then finally, Jeff, if you believe, if you take away a higher force, take away the divine force, and you believe that you are the God, well, then you are going to control the garden, and you have the right to act as gods. That's another philosophical element that crept into the agenda. And so there's no higher force. It's only the will usually man, of humankind. And that's where we get into the kind of sorcery element, the dark element, the pure satisfaction of the will that lies behind sorcery, magic, control, that has been some of the cyberneticians described as the dark side of cybernetics as well.
Well, the earliest humans had no agriculture, as I recall. They were hunters and gatherers. And then it seems to me that the rise of agriculture occurred simultaneous with the rise of empires.
Yes, there's a lot of literature explaining about the significance of agriculture and the shift to particular crops and the cultivation of certain grains, and the distinction between a society which is fixed to the land and a society which is mobile. And there's loads of interest in historical studies of comparing mobile populations with fixed populations. So yes, the empire as it grew up in its later form was particularly associated with the cultivation of crops and the cultivation of a vast amount of estates. So, for example, the latifundia in South America go back to the Roman era, and in Spain there are still plenty of olive groves that go back to the time of Christ, and the direct connection between the conquest of land and the management of land and the imperial endeavor, and the shift away from a society where people they were browsers. If you like, there's a distinction between a sheep and a goat. The goat is seen as a browser that can wander around, another plant image, and the sheep is a grazer, which is kind of fixed in particular places. So there is that idea of the human as well. So yes, agricultural methods and the centralizing forces, the growth of certain technologies, the Roman infrastructure of roads, for example. All roads lead to Rome, but it's still manifest on maps. You can see it from satellite. You can see the structure that goes back to Roman times. So associated with this centralization force was a growth in military technology, and military technology is a critical factor in the evolution of empire, because it allows empire, and empires work by standardization, by harmonization, by making things the same, by making rule everything the same so they can rule from the center.
It takes us back to the title of this interview, Plantations of the Mind. The empire is really trying to implant itself in the minds of its citizens.
Well, yes, it is a remarkable phenomenon that there is a degree of crystallization of the mind of the citizen in an imperial system. So the nice word, for example, of standardizing the laws in the EU is harmonizing. So it sounds like a nice, who doesn't want to be in harmony? But another word for that is making everything the same. It's the same philosophy in commerce, in McDonald's. You go into a McDonald's in Indonesia, it's the same, it's standard. And this homogenization suits centralization. It suits the automatic world. And this process has to inform the mentality of the people involved in it, of the citizens or subjects or objects of this imperial system. So, and that will come down to how they spend their time. So the emperors knew that the plebeians were kind of easily bought off with bread and circuses. And this continues today, unfortunately, that the people ourselves are bought off by cheap entertainment as a distraction from the bigger forces. But what we're facing now is an idea, a direct idea of moving into human consciousness, that the imperial model now sees the dark continent as human consciousness, and it is creating the technology, is mapping out the neurophysiological structure so that it can create the stations, so that it can move in and colonize. And the slight difference now, the medical, pharmaceutical establishments are given rights. So a patent is a legal right over it could be over the land of our consciousness in many ways, a 20-year right to do something as they begin to develop systems. And of course, the idea of implants is a key idea. And that also refers to the deeper idea that was developed, if we look back at Ewan Cameron and the experiments on the mind, Donald Ewan Cameron in Canada in the 60s, and implanting ideas through research into human consciousness. It was the same idea. How could we implant, by psychic driving, ideas into the human mind? Propaganda, propagate, it's the same idea. So the idea that derives from this long tradition is that there will be a plantation of human consciousness. Now, before I started on this endeavor a year or two ago, I hadn't seen any of the recent literature. There's more literature coming out from people that understand. They talk in terms of the plantation scene, plantocracy, and they understand that this historical model is wider than that, and it can be applied to describe what I term the global plantation, although often the academics focus unduly on the US model and don't look in a wider perspective. And I would urge them to see the historical continuity that you talked about when you go.
It does seem to me that it's a question of balance. I know that in our country, in the United States, we drive on the right side of the road. In England, people drive on the left side of the road. And it's very important to follow the rules of whatever jurisdiction you're in, or you're going to get in big trouble. You may lose your life. I think it's more universal. You stop on a red light and go on a green light. But so these things become deeply embedded in our consciousness.
We're talking about rule, and this is a thing that in a lot of discussions and contemporary issues, they don't look at the idea of jurisprudence. And that's the science of law. And Moses would have been concerned with jurisprudence. Muhammad was concerned with jurisprudence, the link between spiritual ideas and making rules. And again, the masters of making rules were the British. That's what they were very, very good at. If you look, I'm not paying any attention to this World Cup in football at the moment for a number of reasons, but I'm not going to watch any of the matches. There's another debate. But in that context, the football, it didn't start off in Britain, but they made the rules and they became the centre of the establishment of world football. And again, as well as we can add cricket, golf, horse racing, it was because they made rules that they standardized these activities. So there's a benefit to standardizing activity. So as we're speaking, there's loads of people around the world playing golf, and they have internalized the rules that were basically established in St. Andrews in Scotland a few hundred years ago, and they automatically adhere to that. So of course there's benefits to rules. But if we look at Alan Turing that we talked about, and when we look at cybernetics, and we look at algorithms are rules as well. How these machines work are on the basis of rules, and they can be programmed. So again, it's no surprise that cybernetics and that Britain and the United States, the Anglosphere, were important in the development of computers and computerization. It followed on. It was going to, because it was the next level of the expansion of a global force, again coming out of the military-industrial complex. It didn't come out of anywhere else. All the developments in telecommunications came out of strategic interest. So that's based on rules again. But we're at a stage in human development where this perfection of rules has become a left brain obsession. And the idea that we'll take out that daft idea that you have, Jeff, of maybe of free will and of being allowed to make decisions, and we'll replace that messy daftness and a messy idea of free will that really doesn't have any credible mathematical base, and replace it by predetermined crystallized forces which will guarantee a kind of universal harmony control of, effectively, of plants. There's a book written by Luther Burbank. If you go into any McDonald's, they seem to use the potato that he developed, the Burbank potato, anyway, again. And he wrote a book in 1907 called The Training of the Human Plant. And this, he was talking about eugenics. And the eugenicists saw the individual as a plant. Now, this is not a new idea, because in particular, one person that influenced me as I was thinking about these issues was your mentor, Arthur M. Young. And he talked in The Reflexive Universe and in conversations with you about his idea of a modified chain of being, the descent of spirit into matter and its rise again. And he made that analysis on the basis of a review of all the esoteric and philosophical traditions. So this idea that we have evolved from matter through plants to animals to humans, we can see it in Aristotle and in Aquinas, and the idea of the vegetative soul. And we talk in medical terms about a person being in a vegetative state. So this idea defines the approach of a lot of scientists and a lot of organizers or controllers. The idea is, well, actually, the human is only some kind of equivalent to a vegetative soul, and the other things are mere add-ons that they're deluded about. So, as Anthony Burgess talked about, there's the danger of the clockwork orange, the idea of this mechanization of the organic. We have already the mechanical or digital apple, which rules the world. So what we're facing is, and another person who's interested in this area is a scholar who has written about automata called Jessica Riskin, and she has written a book called The Restless Clock, and she explains the significance of this idea in looking at automata and the idea of the human as being a clockwork mechanism, and the contrast between that view and some deeper contrasting teleological view. So she argues that people like Richard Dawkins come back to this particular view of human biology, but there is another stream, and I suppose we could refer to Goethe there as being another element, or possibly a contrasting approach to science, to refer back to your earlier question. And of course, he wrote The Metamorphosis of Plants in 1790, and he had the idea of the herb plants, a kind of a universal leaf, a kind of a basic construction or pattern, which anticipated a lot of ideas of fractals and other ideas. But there is a deep conflict. So to come back to your question, rules are important, but generally the rules that are best are rules that reflect consensus, that reflect perceived interest, and we then accept them, particularly if they're voluntary, like in sports, where we say, yeah, that's the optimum way to do so. But if we have a machine of rules which enforces itself on us, well, then it's dangerous. And the last point, I'm sorry, Jeff, going on so long. Last point, if you look at the origins of NATO, in one of the major books, they talk about that the system had to be developed for the machine. It said in one of the main texts, which I've described in the book, that it was machine needs which were dictating global governance. Now, this is putting the cart before the horse, and it's a daft, and it shows you where an obsession with rules begins to forget that rules are to facilitate things. They're not to control everything, and that's the danger of a left brain approach.
Well, since you bring up Goethe and his very seminal work on the nature of plants, and even he goes so far as to look at the relationship between plants and poetry and the archetypal patterns underneath both of these, Goethe was a big influence on the philosopher and esoteric thinker Rudolf Steiner, who wrote extensively on the scientific method and also on society and community. And the idea of an organic way of life in harmony with nature. I know he, for example, advocated architecture that never had right angles or straight lines. All the windows and doors had 5 or 6 sides, and in order to avoid perpendicular lines.
Yes, and that would have been an idea that artists like Hundertwasser, for example, would have taken. He was against the straight line. And part of that objection is because it was a reaction to the idea, if you take Hundertwasser, that we live in a machine, that a house was a machine for living, for example. And if we go back to Steiner, Steiner had looked at, for example, how bees behave. And bees like particular shapes and don't like other shapes. So the natural world is not characterized by this linearity. And so I've emphasized the significance of the loop, but we could also look at the curve and the significance of the curve. And Western society has had that particular bias towards the straight line. And in architecture, there is this dendral form, the dendritic form. If we look back at a lot of the great cathedrals, they represent the articulation in stone of biological patterns. A lot of the trees informed the structure. If you go to the Moorish, the remains of the Moorish mosques in Andalusia in Spain, you see that they're based on geographical or on tree motifs, whether the date palm or in particular in the Alhambra has the pomegranate, and the pomegranate informed the whole architecture. But in those cases, they were trying to reflect a divine consciousness. And Goethe certainly had a broader idea of the nature of science and an idea of, consistent with C.S. Lewis, of being an observer and integrating in some way into the process and not trying to dominate it. So he would be another person we could contrast in relation to your question about the Baconian alternatives. And that opposite trend, which didn't focus on the mechanism as critical. And Steiner was plants were very important for him. He didn't emphasize. He said there's limitations to the comparison of plants and humans. He said, of course, a plant could be regarded as an upside down human, where the bulb is the head, etc., and made the comparisons. So there's others who were more, although he was very interested in agriculture and the significance of agriculture in relation to the analogy between humans and plants. There are other ones that are forgotten. For example, Carl Jung, and I was in the garden the other day, Jeff. I was just showing you. Now this is not from the garden, but I don't know if you can see this. This is a stick basically that you'd find. It's a stick would be regarded as a medicine man's stick anywhere you'd find in various countries, with the snake and so it's like Asclepius's rod. Sometimes you have 2 snakes. And Carl Jung, I was reading Carl Jung, and he emphasizes plants. And I found this in the garden the other day, and you can see that there's I don't know if you can see that there is a plant which is growing, and then a vine, like I think it's woodbine, has grown around it, which produces the exact same result. And he said that instead of thinking about the snake in the garden, in one interview, he said you should think about the serpentine form. And I was thinking that was a perfect example for me of that the idea of one thing that we associate with a snake may actually refer to a different serpentine form. For example, DNA is a serpentine form. And Carl Jung made those points, and he identified clearly the connection between the plant and the spirit. Although in a lot of the discussions about Jung, that element is ignored. But certainly, as you've mentioned, Goethe, Steiner, and Jung as well, I would put in the equation, are people who understood the ubiquitous nature of plants. I won't show you another plant I have there that I cut in the garden, but it's a vine from some grapes that were planted in the garden. And if we go back to the Bible, of course, Jesus says, I am the vine and you are the branches. And that's something that people don't pay too much attention to, but it's a deep metaphor and what that means. And there's an interesting comparison between the images that people use. The vine presumes that you become the fruit in your spiritual development. That's obviously the implication. And the idea of fruit is associated with developing the Spirit, the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians. And opposite to that, we have an idea of ivy, which is similar to a vine, but it often occurs as an example of something which is parasitic on other plants. So it doesn't have the same purpose. Now, in pagan traditions, ivy has a lot of beneficial aspects, but we often have clubs which are associated with people coming together for particular purpose, and it's associated with ivy. James Joyce wrote a book, Ivy Day at the Committee, or an essay, a short story, Ivy Day at the Committee Room, and he uses ivy as a symbol of people joining together for purposes which are not beneficial. So it's right throughout philosophy, but we don't pay too much attention to the exactitude of the particular stories. And all the major thinkers have something important to say about plants. So the argument would be we should actually pay closer attention to how they're talking about plants and whether their view moves us to an idea that we can actually continue our symbiotic relationship with plants, or whether it moves us to an idea that we move away from the natural world and we be treated as plants in the mechanical garden with the machines in the garden. And that's where the tug is between the two tendencies and the two different directions. So sorry, I went on a bit long there. So
no, I thought you were about to make a very important point about the two directions.
Point being is that if we choose to regard the natural world as something that can be transformed into a mechanical, metallic plant garden with the human assimilated into that system, we go to a very different place than if we seek to tend towards some idea of affinity with the natural world, as the native people are telling us to do so, as all the indigenous people are telling us to do so, as all the religious traditions tell us to do so. So we have a direct choice. So although there are patterns, all people are interested in rules, for example, but it's what the function of those are. And my concern is that we are committing ourselves irreversibly to a situation where we go from machine in the garden to the garden of the machine to the plantation to the solid state entity. And that's when you've talked with John Lilly, and that's what he described as a system which was coming, where we transform the organic world into a world of silicon, lithium, and iron, and replace the natural world. A lot of people don't believe that this is a reality, but that's the implication of an overly developed, concentrated, crystallized, left brain, imperial scientific view, not conditions, not balanced in the way that you've talked about, by understanding the full human flourishing, and even the world flourishing, as you've talked about with Stefan Schwartz. It comes from the word flower, so it's ubiquitous. We have to have a proper idea and a proper relationship and a proper commitment to the natural world and a proper awareness of really how serious the diverse forces are that can turn us into. Sorry, I have to finish off now that you've started. The last point is, now that people are understanding the mycorrhizal connection underground between fungus with trees, this, I believe, is the model for our connection with the internet. The idea that as the fungus creates a symbiotic connection with the tree, if the internet penetrates into our body, well, then we are unified in a system of information exchange. But the consequence of that is that we become fixed, we become planted, we become plants. And that is, and when free will is taken, when those algorithms through a symbiotic system that interpenetrates into human consciousness can signal to us what behavior is appropriate, we lose free will and we go back down this. We go into reverse. Instead of evolving, as Arthur M. Young talked about, we go into a devolved state. We go back down the chain of being.
Well, you've brought up native indigenous people as a model for how we should be thinking of our relationship with nature. And the sad thing is not only are they a model, but you might say they're the canary in the coal mine because they've been decimated. Native people throughout the world are suffering from drug abuse, alcohol abuse, high rates of suicide, and poverty. So as much as I respect their philosophies, one is tempted to say, don't go in that direction or you'll end up like they did.
What happened, if you look at the Irish context, and this is a thing that people don't really understand, and Franz Fanon wrote about this in The Wretched of the Earth. Say, for example, you can take the colonization of Ireland at any particular date, but say take it 1169, and say it was going on for 800 years. 800 years of colonization, of genocide, of destruction of culture. It's a devastating effect on a psychic, on a cultural and generation. I don't think Ireland ever recovered from that, despite independence, because there's an argument that it takes a number of generations, and Fanon made that argument. The consequences of disturbing organic development go on for generations. And it may, by the time Ireland joined the European community, there's an argument that it hadn't fully recovered its psychic independence. I don't think it did. The same thing is applied to the native people. I went and stayed on a reservation, and I was sick when I was there, and I was wondering, why was I sick? And I was sick because they stick these horrible industrial plants near the reservations as well. So the water was probably contaminated. And you used a very accurate phrase, the canary in the coal mine. That is the title of an essay from a book I got when I was over in talking in Canada years ago. It was a book by Jace Weaver, a collection of writings. He was from Yale. I think he was Cherokee, very interesting man. And we talked about all these issues, but what has been done to native people will take generations to cure, and the struggles are still going on as you know, with the Sioux and Standing Rock and all these struggles. It was only a week or two ago, I think it was a week ago, that the Sioux got a return of some of the things that were lost in the Battle of Wounded Knee that had been in a museum. That was good that the museum returned them. But these things are very, very significant because they have retained that connection to the land and their ancestors. So I know there is also another problem in relation to the models that are applied. For example, this idea of welfare capitalism. It's a very, very dangerous, the idea that you make people dependent on welfare. That's a strategy that's used by the left and the right, and that has been devastating. So, but instead of talking to the poor people that have found it very, very difficult to escape from that vicious cycle, one has to listen to the most articulate who have been able to be successful in both worlds and who have explained very cogently how there is a Native American theology, how this relates to mining, how this relates to destruction of water, and how this can be applied in a modern context. So we have to look to those voices, and there's a lot of younger voices coming through, and they will be able to tell us. And again, in Ireland has lost its concept of indigeneity. It's lost a lot of that, and it's a major loss. And I don't think it'll be able, unfortunately, to recover those. So we have to bear in mind that these are the poison fruits of colonization. But these problems are going to visit the industrial worlds, if you like, the perpetrators historically, the systems, not the people, the systems that created them. And so it will come back to haunt them as well. We won't be able to escape these issues.
It begs the question, let's say specifically with regard to the Irish, if they can't recover their original connection with their origins, with nature, I don't know, perhaps that's the Druid culture, I'm not sure. Where do they go from here? Where do we go from here?
Well, a lot of people would contest that, and I'm sure they would say that's not true, and we're looking back at it again, and there is little shoots of it. But really, what we're talking about is a situation where Ireland is one of the most globalized economies in the world, and if you're a globalized economy, you're open to all the forces, all the short-term, long-term influences of movement of capital, and the movement of capital and the commercial culture begins to take over and standardize and homogenize. And also Ireland is jumped from almost a pre-industrial society towards a high-tech service economy, and therefore has an alternative model to, and most people are happy with that. A lot of people are very happy with where the country is going in that sense. So they might contest the idea that or that we can't look backwards, or that you're conservative in some sense because you do. But really, we're talking about a shift in the evolution of humanity, and whether we consider ourselves as natural beings who are part of an environment in any way, or whether we are moving into the Crystal Palace, we're moving into this totally controlled environment, indoors, maybe surrounded by glass, where we're influenced, where we become linked to the system that governs us, and don't have a relationship with animals or the outside world in any meaningful sense. And the more and more we do that, we have to become more and more fixed. We have to become more immobile. And if you look at the plans, for example, associated with environmental evolution, they are telling us, they're quite clear, they're planning to phase out and make it more difficult for people to drive or to move around or to travel on airplanes. So you're not going, this promise of globalization was a tactic in an overall strategy for control. And I've studied globalization quite a bit. But the consequence will be that we will be fixed more and more. We won't be moving around in the same way. There will be high-speed mitigations and other things eventually. But the plan is really to fix us a bit more. But we're fixed in a metropolitan technological environment without that connection to nature. And it's very, very important. And people see that technological plant. And this is important because you mentioned as well that Arthur M. Young mentioned this point about how technology is called plant. All telecommunications is called plant. And because they are plant in a particular mind, they're analogous to a plant system. So all this technological infrastructure is a new metallic plant that we will be in a symbiotic relationship with. So it's not just about the Irish people, it's about all people that when they come to a particular level, they have choices to make, that they can either go into a total technosphere or something which is a balance, which accepts, as Lawrence van der Post, who wrote The Bushmen of the Kalahari, said, the greatest longing in human nature is to unite what's oldest in us with the newest. So if we can take the benefits of the thinking process, of the paradigms that existed informed by indigenous and the best indigenous thinking, with the best of technology, then we may be able to get a better balance. But if we commit to one, then we have to remember what Blake said. And Blake said that science is the tree of death. So, I mean, it's quite stark. Science, talking about Newtonian science is the tree of death. And this tree, we even see it in the idea of the knowledge tree, which is a kind of a funny inversion of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, becomes the knowledge tree in the structures of these systems. The cybernetic systems are often defined by trees. And threads, which comes from plants, another philosophy associated with that, and we lose it, and we lose the idea of ourselves in that as well. Because if we look at people, the traditionalists like Ananda Coomaraswamy, he explained how if you look at a lot of early cultures in the Indian arts, for example, you see that the model is that the gods developed the water and the plants directly. That's the next stage. So we have a plant coming from the water, which is in all cultures. Now, I think that comes from giving birth, and when the waters break, and then the child comes, and you have the placenta, which is the tree of life. And I think that's where that deep mythic sense, came from. But later that develops where we get a thread doctrine, and the threads are associated with cloth and weaving, which is a next iteration, and that informs a lot of deep philosophical ideas. But we're shifting to a system where our whole world will be defined in digital terms, by networks, by algorithms, by machines, by metal, by silicon, by lithium. And a lot of people that I have discussions with who are very much in favor of high technology, they never tell you about the environmental cost. They never tell you about the environmental cost of electric cars, for example. Or if you go, as someone reported to me, to British Caledonia, and you see the big mounds of earth which is necessary to get access to lithium for the batteries, they never tell you about all those environmental costs. And the mining necessary to make this solid state entity come into being is huge. And that is attacking resources, is digging up sacred sites all over the world for this network that people keep telling us is, in some way more environmentally friendly. So there's a high cost. So there is a if we don't get the balance that you've talked about, there is a stark choice between two different models, and they're not reconcilable.
Well, James Tunney, once again, a very provocative, stimulating conversation. I thoroughly enjoy these discussions. I think, like you, or like all of our viewers, we're caught in between two worlds, so to speak. I'm a big advocate for the world of consciousness and the vastness of the human spirit and the human soul. I think you are too. So I'm delighted to continue these conversations with you as long as we both desire, as long as we can keep finding new angles to have in our discussions. Thank you once again so much for being with me.
Well, thanks very much. And the last point, the great benefit for me is that in many ways you are a living authority, as the native people would say, and you're a source because of your embeddedness in that culture of discussion in California and the people around the world you've talked to. And so that helps very much in relation to having a sensible dialogue about the possibilities and the options. And if we go back to Genesis, there was the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And people say, well, why would God punish the people for choosing one? I don't think that was the moral of the story. The moral of the story was that there are consequences if you choose one, and we can say, don't put your hand in the fire. If you do put your hand in the fire, there are consequences for what happened. You might learn. There's different ways of learning, so that's what we're talking about. And you're not against technology. I'm not against technology. You are in favor of the exploration of consciousness. So am I. And I think that if we get the balance right, as you said, that's the optimum way. And if we get the balance informed by the left and the right brain, that we can solve these problems. Otherwise, just dystopia. But thank you again, as always, a great pleasure. Thank you.
And for those of you listening and watching, thank you for being with us.